Welcome to the Sourcing Hero podcast, produced by Una, a group purchasing organization that empowers sourcing heroes, and Art of Procurement, the world's largest procurement podcast network. I'm your host, Kelly Barnard. The goal of the Sourcing Hero podcast is to capture the epic stories of people who are rising up and beating the odds to create exceptional value within procurement, directly from those heroes themselves. Today, my guest here on the Sourcing Hero podcast is Kris Lance. Kris is Vice President and General Manager at Una, a group purchasing organization and the home of the Sourcing Hero. Kris joins me every month to tackle a current news story or topic of interest from his own point of view. So, hi, Kris. Happy August. Thanks for being back on the show.
Can't believe summer's already almost over. Happy to be here. How are you doing?
You can almost hear the school buses rolling down the road, depending on what part of the country you're in, right?
Yeah, ours started rolling this week. So,
they did.
Yes.
Okay, well, this show will air the day after our school buses start rolling. So we're all kind of in the same back to school, which is an interesting thought because we're going to do something a little bit different today. Instead of specifically taking on one news story or one topic, we're going to think about thinking. And actually, I needed to know, Kris. So I Googled this. Is there a word that means thinking about thinking? And there is. Metacognition. So not necessarily catchy, but today we're going to think about how we think. And if people have listened to past episodes of ours, this is going to very quickly make sense. If you haven't, scroll down wherever you're listening to this, and you'll see that in the show notes are the last 4 of these conversations that Kris and I have had. I think even looking at the titles of the episodes will give you a sense of where we tend to focus. But we're constantly getting hit by both complicated topics that have a lot of facets to them, and also either sensational or polarizing coverage. So it's very difficult to focus on the facts of what's already a really complicated subject without sort of being blown around off your default position by, colorful language and people trying to push their bias. So what I want to ask you as we start this conversation, when you hear something new, especially when it's on a really sensitive topic, what are the things that influence how you feel about that topic or piece of news?
So that's a loaded question right out of the gate. And I say that because, so in my mind, I'll speak for myself, right? I actually try to do quite a few things simultaneously. But obviously there's I would say a memory flow of how that actually processes out. So the first thing I try to do is remove emotion altogether, which is, everybody says that, but it's actually a lot tougher than it sounds. To your point, especially when it's on a hot button topic or something so polarizing, or maybe it's not, in the main news, but maybe it's tied to one of your closely held beliefs, right? So either way, regardless of why you feel so strongly about something, you have to remove the emotion. And so all you're left with is facts. I think it goes without saying, but I'll say it. It's important to do that, though, because I would argue either we've all done it or experienced it or maybe watched it happen. But emotion is probably one of the easiest ways to cloud your own judgment. And it's just not good. But the second thing I look to do is I consider, maybe whether it's a person or maybe this source, right? But what I always ask myself is, what does this source have to gain from telling me this information? Is there anything? And I think a little bit of that is because I'm a naturally skeptical person, but really what I'm trying to do in those moments is assess whether or not I can even trust the information. So in that process, right, if I don't trust the information, well, then in most cases, maybe I'm done here, or depending on what I'm seeing, maybe I'm trying to sound the alarm if I think maybe the information is misleading or malicious. But if I can trust the information, or I can trust the source, then I move into the next stage, which is okay, well, how is this going to impact me? How is this going to impact my family or those that I love and care about? It's kind of like what do I do with this, right? And so once I've gone through all that and I can trust this information, I do know there's something actionable, I'll admit this, I actually then try to inject the appropriate emotion back into the equation. And I do that personally because I think that emotion can be an incredible driver, whether it's love, hate, fear, joy, anxiety, passion. They're all great drivers. But again, at the front, gotta remove we gotta remove the emotion, because I've never seen that help in decision making. So long-winded way of saying I separate everything and then I put it back together again.
I think that's really interesting. And I think your acknowledgement that at the end, the emotion needs to come back in is actually a really powerful final step, because one of the things that we're going to talk about before we wrap today is living life and building relationships across some of these divides. And I think if you can pull a safe portion of your own emotion back into it, part of what that allows you is empathy for somebody who might be on the other side of the table.
Yep, exactly.
Right? Because they might hold a directly opposite position. It might not be something where it's this or that. And instead, it's just a very different perspective on something that you're both looking at. But being able to, if at all possible, put on their shoes and walk around a little bit and get enough of a sense of how they are feeling that you can comprehend it, even if you're not necessarily swayed to sharing their opinion or holding the same beliefs. It at least gives you sort of a sense of capacity or appreciation for maybe what was in their background that led them to hold a different opinion from you. So much of this, and you can go to like fill in the blank, any hot button issue, right? One of the things that I'll challenge myself to do, so I'm going to add this to your challenge about adding the emotion back on at the end. I try to sort of transpose what I think should be done. So if I see something that bothers me and I think to myself, oh, the obvious solution for that situation is X. Either, okay, let's take that solution, which is never obvious, because if it were, someone would be doing it.
Right.
Take that and either transfer it into a situation that actually happened in the messy real world where solutions are not quite so easy, or into sort of an adjacent situation. Like, okay, this problem wasn't caused by this, it was caused by that. Would the solution have made any difference? Because again, it gives you that sense of, why hasn't somebody fixed this? And it's a reminder that this is so much harder than it looks in most cases from where we're sitting, assuming we don't have direct involvement or firsthand involvement in the situation. Now, that's sort of how we handle things within our own heads. Let's say you're going to have a discussion about one of these sensitive topics with someone who's likely to disagree. How do you, both from, let's say an emotional standpoint and also an information standpoint, prepare yourself to enter into that conversation?
Well, so I've been having a lot of those lately.
I think we all have.
Right. So I guess if you're gonna have an argument, or let's just call it a spirited debate, right? And the goal is to get your point across. I do have something I try to follow, and it's my knee-jerk, response is, well, just make sure you're ready to listen and not get your point across. But it's like, well, how do you do that? Like, how do you do that in the moment? So what I try to do, and I believe I actually got this from Jordan Peterson. I don't know if he got it from somebody else, but what he had said, and I would agree. I share this opinion, but unless you can clearly articulate the opposing viewpoint back to the person you're going to argue with, and here's the key part, and they agree with your summary of their viewpoint and stance, unless that happens, you absolutely have no business even having a debate, right? And I was like, well, that doesn't make any sense. I have to understand somebody else's viewpoint that intimately. And it's like, well, yes. I mean, if you're truly seeking a good outcome, then you have to understand that, because otherwise there's no way to measure the direction even of the conversation, right? I'm sure we've all had those disagreements, right? Where, after 30 minutes, you're like, are we right at the beginning? Like, how did that happen?
We've come back around
Yeah,
again.
we've just gone full circle and nothing's happened, but maybe both of us or all of us are now frustrated or irritated. So it really is as simple though, is like, how can I change somebody else's mind? Or how can I, better said, how can I even open someone else's mind if I don't understand where they're coming from to begin with? But also selfishly, there's benefit in that too, like simply just preparing for that type of a conversation. Because if you approach it that way, it actually forces you to open your own mind,
Yeah.
and it actually allows you to connect with the person before you even connect with the person on that topic. So I guess what I'm saying is kind of like by default, you're gonna the points or the critical elements that will resonate with the other person. By default, you're gonna be equipped with that information, so long as you're going into, well, what's their understanding. And I guess we've all seen this, whether it be on LinkedIn or on a poster somewhere, but it's real in the sense that far too many people listen only to respond as opposed to listening to learn or grow. And so if neither party is willing to learn or understand, how do you fill that gap? And the answer is you can't. So rather than focusing so much on, you have to understand my point, it's more of, well, where are you even coming from? How do we bridge that divide, if you will? So
I actually think that's an excellent call out. So, in that, you talked about sort of two different situations, and let's just, for the sake of simplicity, assume there's two people in this
right.
conversation. I'm not ready for four or five, but if you are coming to the conversation from the perspective of, how am I going to convince this other person,
Mhm.
even if it's not to agree with me, but of the validity of my point of view, you sort of prepare one way. If you come to the conversation thinking, okay, there's this topic, we feel very differently about it. I would like to understand first what this other person thinks, and then together with them, figure out, where do we agree, where do we disagree, and why. Those are sort of two very different approaches to the conversation. And maybe starting from a place of, how do I think I'm coming to this conversation, and how do they think they're coming to this conversation? Because you can almost picture one of those classic little consulting quadrants on this, where if you both think you're coming to the conversation to convince the other to agree with you, you're about, what, T minus 5 minutes to yelling.
Right, right.
And that's not constructive unless you happen to be into that sort of thing. Whereas if you acknowledge from the outset, this is a tricky subject, and almost not formally, but establish ground rules or an expectation that we feel differently. That's
Mhm.
okay. I would like to learn more about what you think and why. And I would like if you would be open to the same from me. Now you've really laid the groundwork for what can be an incredibly powerful, not just conversation, but learning opportunity for both sides. I don't know how many of these topics, how frequently we can get to that point on, but I
Mhm.
feel like it needs to be the goal.
Yeah, absolutely. And it could be, we could even just simplify it into like, I don't know, just set down your ego, right? Like
Yep.
if you could just for 30 seconds at the onset of the conversation, pretend you're wrong. Like really, like, and truly pretend you're wrong, and like, so you're hearing something for the first time. I absolutely agree with you. I absolutely agree with you though. Yep.
Now, we've talked about where sort of you hold one opinion and somebody else holds another.
Mhm.
Let's then sort of extend that into a situation where a topic is complicated or meaty enough that you could actually potentially have a disagreement with yourself,
Mm.
right? So a little bit of cognitive dissonance. So you hold one thing to be true, but you also hold another thing to be true. Sometimes two things can be true at the same time, and it doesn't matter.
Mhm.
Other times, in order for one thing to be true, you have to be able to re-examine the other. And I've definitely been in situations where that was the case for me. That's one of those where I tend to almost experience it physically, like your nerves kick up,
Right. Yep.
and you've got to work through that. How do you find yourself thinking your way through these times when two things really can't exist in harmony and both be true?
Yeah, those are tough moments. I know exactly, you painted a picture, right? But I know exactly that feeling. It's almost like I can feel electricity in my body. It's
Yeah.
start getting hot. If I'm being honest, I personally I pray about it. We actually, in our kitchen, we have a little note in the kitchen window that, and all it says on there is, "Have you prayed about it?"
Mm,
And I say that though is because oftentimes when I'm having an internal conflict on two things that, like, on that level of intensity, what I realize and know about myself is, okay, you need to go have a reality check conversation with yourself. And what I've found in those times, in those like reality check conversations, is it's most times it's actually not a conflict but two separate things. It's usually a conflict within myself that I'm making it the topic's fault. And so, like, what I mean by that, for example, would be, maybe I know what's right, but maybe I don't want to do it, or I don't want to support it.
okay.
Or maybe I know what's wrong, but I don't want to be hanged for it. So maybe I won't say that. And so in those moments, yeah, I pray about it because they're extremely or hyper personal. And it's actually a conflict around those. For me, most times it's competing morals.
Mm,
So very similar to, I think it was the last conversation we had. If you're not very, faith driven, an application that would still work would be doing the 5 whys, because really what you're ultimately, or what I try to do, is get to the root to really resolve it. So anytime there's a conflict internally, anxiety or pressure, things like that, you got to get to the root. And so for me, the best way to do that is to really be honest with yourself and asking those whys. Um, why do I feel this way? Should I feel this way? And again, they're not easy conversations to have, especially when you're especially when you're having them with yourself. Um, but
although you're bound to win and lose, I
yes,
suppose.
exactly. You always win and lose. So that, I guess, the good thing is the outcome every time.
That's true.
But that's what I do. Yeah.
Now, one of the other things, and I think it's been maybe a few episodes since this has come up, but this has become a long running joke between you and I, both on the air and off, is your now famous do not say list.
Yeah.
In fact, I've told you there's been a few times where, with two high schoolers in the house, I'm thankful for this concept. Somebody has come home and said to me, nope, I didn't talk about it. It was on my do not say list,
That's
right?
awesome.
That list of things.
Yep.
Deciding what goes on that list
Hmm.
is sort of like a moving scale, because there were things, even if I think back, I'll go simple, 2 years ago. I don't want to go all the way back to 2020 because I'm done
Yeah.
with 2020.
Right.
But if we go back a couple of years, I can think of things where I would say, oh, no, you can never talk about those things in a professional setting and have it be okay. And some of those things today, I find we need to talk about those things
Mm-hmm.
because they're starting to impact the way we do our job. One very straightforward answer is politics. That's sort of the biggest conversational grenade of them all. A couple of years ago, I definitely would have said there is no place for politics in professional conversations. And here we sit today, not all that long out before a presidential election in the United States, looking at different policies on trade and energy and some of these topics and thinking business strategy will need to change depending on the outcome of the election. So, in an appropriate context, we need to be able to talk about these things in advance. So, we're not waiting until the day after the results come out and starting then.
Mm-hmm.
How do you decide as time goes on what belongs on the do not say list, and either when it's time to add something new or when it's time to take something off and very carefully say, all right, we've held back. I think it's time to talk about this. How do you sort of take the temperature of each room and figure out what belongs on that list?
So to your point on my do not say list, right? And I'll start with its current state. That list, it's actually dwindling down to about nothing, and that's on purpose. A lot of it's, to your point, is because seemingly every day things that maybe yesterday it wasn't okay to say, now it is okay today. But it's also the relevance of each topics. Sometimes you have to have those conversations. And so Another reason I'm actually starting to be more vocal or careful about actually what I put on the list, rather as being more careful of what's coming off, is I'm personally, I'm seeing things, and I've seen things in the past where, people have been misled, or maybe tricked. And so what I'm trying to do is share information so they can make better decisions for themselves. And that's the lens that I look through on what goes on the list or what comes off, whether it's, friends, families, business partners, things like that. That said, I'm mostly only having those conversations now if someone's reaching out to engage with me.
Okay.
I've spent the last few years, and sometimes even with you, Kelly, right? But sounding the alarm on, hey, this is coming, or hey, watch out for this. And so now I'm kind of in this, you can't see me, but I'm air quoting, but kind of more of this circling the wagons, if you will, so to
Yeah.
speak. And so another reason I'll be pretty vulnerable here. I think I suffer a little bit from imposter syndrome, right? And so there's some times where maybe I'm doubting or questioning my own intellect, or things that I'm spouting out, right? Like, are these patterns I'm recognizing only in my head? Does anybody else see this as well? Things like that. So so again, typically now the things that I don't want to touch on, it's really just the things that I don't intimately know. If it's not something that I've studied, read on, explored, and dare I say, like, had those arguments with myself
Yeah.
beforehand, then there's a pretty good chance I'm not going to touch it. And the reason for that is because everything seems so hot. But then also when I do my research, it's like, well, it's really tough to find out what's real anymore. So um, that's there's very little of that though. I want all the smoke, So when I say there's very little of that, there's very little that I'm not reading, researching, studying. I'm down to have just about any conversation, because I'm diving into details on things more than I ever have. I'm studying now more, Kelly, than I ever did in college. And I think the reason for that is because we're in such a critical time in
Yeah.
what will be history, and it's just such a bad time to be asleep at the wheel. So.
And the more informed we all are,
Mhm.
and that sort of takes us back through, it probably is almost necessary to go through those times of cognitive dissonance.
Mhm.
And regardless of your perspective, I'd be with you, right? First step, pray on it, think on it, reflect on it, go to
Mhm.
trusted people and say, I'm really struggling with this. Can we talk it through? But if we're not feeling some level of discomfort with some portion
Mm.
of the news, then it's probably a disconnect. And so there's probably more of us feeling that, you get hot, I get stomach aches.
Mhm.
We're all probably feeling some level of that sort
Mhm.
of on a physical and an emotional level, which brings me to my last question. We usually try to end these things on a very human centric note. And the thing I think that's at the heart of everything we've talked about today is, despite opinions and experiences and perspectives, the relationships that we want to be able to have despite those differences.
Mm.
How can we prevent disagreement, differing points of view about these core passion driven topics from dividing us from our friends and family?
Well, so speaking from experience, unfortunately, the reality is that very well may happen. I mean, goodness, if you look back to, I know we don't want to touch it, right? But 2019, 2020, I mean, look at that debacle alone, what it did to some families. It
Yep.
was it was wild. I guess I would answer it and I would say, look, well, once upon a time, people used to be able to disagree and still move forward. Um, and I think we've touched on this lightly in the past, but one of the many things that made the US so great was the ability to disagree. But there was still almost like this unwritten rule of, but we're still going to find a way to move forward together, with
Right.
unity. And so when I look around now, well, that seems to have stopped, honestly, and it's kind of scary. And I think I've said this before too, but when you look at history, the moment people stop talking or having conversations, just absolutely terrible, terrible things can happen and have happened. So I guess, in answer to your question, I would actually pose a challenge to anyone or everyone who's listening. And I really hope it's taken seriously. And the message is just don't stop talking. I mean, yeah, of course, there's going to be some cases where it's actually healthier to leave things alone. But I would argue that most of those are going to be pretty rare instances, like where the divide is just too massive or both parties just refuse to concede. Like an example of the reason I say it's so rare, like an example would be, I'm not going to go visit the Pope and try and explain why he should be a Buddhist. It's like choose your battles, but
yes,
but instead find a way to make it force yourself, because I think you'll be better for it by continuing to lean in and have those conversations. And then just like we were talking about earlier today, it's, if you approach the conversations with like truly seeking to understand as opposed to like seeking to teach, all conversations will go dramatically differently. So,
yeah. And I guess my final thought on that, it's interesting. I have the notes in front of me, right? Thinking about thinking and metacognition. But really what it comes down to is you can't think or think about thinking without being thoughtful. And in this case, that extends to the people around us. If we are considerate in our choice of words and considerate in our ability to listen and considerate about the context of when we decide to broach a certain topic with someone, hopefully that's enough to make sure that good intent gets across and keep us out of too much trouble, but continuing to be curious and thoughtful, and mindful of the bigger picture, but never putting any of these issues ahead of relationships. Not easy, to be sure, right? But a journey that I genuinely believe most people are on. And to your point, if we could talk about it, we'd be going through a lot less of this in isolation, and we would probably find out we share a lot more common ground than we realize.
Yeah. It's almost like I absolutely love that. I'm like jotting it down. Maybe we'll put it on a t-shirt, but it's like, you can't think without being thoughtful. Like chef's kiss. I'll absolutely love that. Awesome.
Well, thank you for that, Kris.
Yes.
If people have found us today for the first time and are meeting you through this conversation, what is the best way for them to reach out and get in touch?
Well, you can always email me. So that's Kris, Kris @una.com. You can also go to una.com. If you go to About Us, you can click on my face and get in touch with me that way. I am on LinkedIn. It's Kris with a K, Kris Lance, and you can send me a message that way too. So,
Kris, thank you so much, and I will look forward to doing this again next month. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Sourcing Hero podcast. Join us again next time for more true stories of sourcing and business heroism performed by your colleagues and peers. Look for the Sourcing Hero wherever you get your podcasts, and don't forget to subscribe. Finally, don't forget, sourcing heroism is taking place all around us every day. Keep your eyes open and you're bound to see it. Until next time, I'm your host, Kelly Barner. Stay well, and always remember that you can be a hero too.